We like to think of words like individual atoms, discrete little units of meaning. You learn a new word, it goes in your collection, and now you own it. That's the model. We're creating a reference dictionary in our head, each word with its own clean definition. It's how most of us intuitively think about words. It's how dictionaries are structured. It's how language learning classes are taught. It's how we talk about our own progress. We say, I learned a new word today, like we stored a new definition in our mind. But what if how we talk about words doesn't reflect the reality of how our brain stores them? I want to do an experiment to show what I mean. I'm going to give you some words, and I want you to think about it. I want you to define these words as I give you them. Even pause the video if you want to try. Could you define with? Could you define yet? Could you define well? Could you define just? My guess is no matter how long I give you, you just won't be able to define those words to your own satisfaction. Yet you can still understand them and use them perfectly fine. Because there's a huge gap between how we think we know words and how we actually know words. And if you're trying to learn a language, understanding this will change how you think about reaching fluency. You'll understand why the question, how many repetitions until I can learn a word, actually paints an incomplete picture of language learning. What's going on, guys? My name's Nick. I'm the creator of Lengualytics and a fluent speaker of the Spanish language. So let's go back to that first experiment. Let's see what happens in our mind when we try to define a word like just. The first thing you probably do is think of situations that just has shown up in. I just want one. Just yesterday. That's just wrong. Just like that. Just because. Your brain doesn't reach for some atomic definition first. Instead, it looks at situations first. That's a clue. Because if words are really like objects that we store in our heads, like little atoms floating around in our heads, then we should be able to go into our head, locate the atom, crack it open, and inside there should be the definition. But that's not what happens. When you try to define just, you go searching through your library of experience. Every conversation, every sentence, every scene that word has appeared in your entire life. And what you try to do is reverse engineer a definition given those examples. What that tells us is we actually don't understand words in isolation. We understand a word based on everything that's sat next to them. We understand a word by the company that word keeps. That's a quote I heard recently. I'm going to put the author of the quote on the screen. We understand words in relation to other words, in relation to situations, in relation to contexts. Words don't exist in our mind atomically, they exist in our mind relationally. But maybe you're thinking the word just is a special case. Just a weird little word, a modifier, a piece of grammar glue. Of course you can't define a word like just cleanly, but what about a word like dog? You can obviously define a word like dog, right? When I ask you to define dog, focus on what happens in your head. Focus on the picture. It's probably not a written definition. It's probably an image, a specific dog, a specific breed probably. Maybe the dog looks friendly. Maybe he's in a park. Maybe he's wagging his tail. Maybe the dog has a collar. Now, obviously you're seeing a dog of a specific breed, but there's tons of breeds. Not every dog is the same breed. And if the dog you're imagining looks friendly, I'd ask, are all dogs friendly? If the dog you're picturing is wearing a collar, I would ask, do all dogs wear collars? Do you really know what a dog is, or do you just know what a dog has? To make this point that I'm making clearer, try to explain why a dog isn't a wolf. Genetically, they're almost physically identical. 4 legs, fur, teeth, tails. You'd struggle to give a clean physical rule that excludes one and includes the other. Some people will immediately think something like pointy ears or big fangs, the aggressive features, but they forget about huskies or German shepherds. What you actually end up pointing at to distinguish a dog from a wolf is stuff like domestication, friendliness, being a pet. But we have to remember that those things aren't intrinsic to dogs themselves. Nowhere in the fabric of reality is it written that dogs are always pets, or dogs always wear collars, or dogs are always friendly. Yet that's what most of us picture when we imagine them. To you and I, a dog isn't just some scientific classification of a certain animal. A dog is the totality of every dogness experience we've ever had. The word is a label that sits on top of a set of relationships. It's not a scientifically accurate definition. So let's visualize this with the specialty of this channel, our favorite branch of mathematics, graph theory. To catch everybody up who doesn't follow me, a graph in this sense is not a chart, it's a network. It has two basic pieces, nodes and edges. A node is a point, an edge is a connection between 2 points. The reason graph theory exists is so that we can reduce complexity and easily visualize relationships. So let's draw out a dog. The word dog is the node. Picture it as a single point. Now think about what's connected to it. Every dog you've ever met. Every dog from a movie or a book, every conversation where the word came up, every adjective that sat next to it, big, loyal, lazy, good, every concept it travels with, bark, leash, fetch, collar. Each one of those is an edge attached to that node. And if you think back to when you pictured a dog, these are the things that you thought of, not a list of the essential features that biologically describe the animal. You collect so much relational data about each word over your lifetime that the network of relationships becomes dense enough to behave like a single node in its own right. Picture a spider web. It's made up of a ton of small strings, but those strings are so tightly packed that it behaves more like a solid surface. That's why we think we understand dog as one unified concept, when what we're really experiencing is the weight of every dog association we've ever made. The relational information is just so dense that it feels to us like something singular. So what does this show us about how the brain stores information, or more specifically, how the brain stores words? It shows us that all the information about what a dog is comes from the edges, not the node. The definition of dog in your brain is more like the totality of all these connections than the singular atom we assumed it was at the start of the video. So what we have now is a basic intuition about how our brain actually stores words. Now I want to take that intuition and bring it into language learning. Bring it into how we learn words, not just how we store them. Imagine you're learning English. When you first encounter a word in English, let's say the word carry, for instance, what's happening is your brain is creating a fresh node. Barely any edges, no web around it. And the entire process of learning that word, from that first encounter to the day you can use it automatically like a word in your native language, is the process of adding edges around that node. The first time you hear carry, your brain attaches edges to anything that might help define it. What object was being carried? What does a person look like when they carry? What kind of person can carry? Your brain takes the surrounding context and adds them as edges to the node. None of that is a definition of carry, it's just a handful of associations attached to a word your brain just heard for the first time. The next time you hear carry in a different context, you get more edges. Over hundreds of encounters, the edges stop becoming countable. These lines that I'm using to represent edges don't do the model justice. Picture a dense web of associations, millions of connections. Gradually, the word starts to mean something to you the same way it means something to a native speaker, through that network. You in your lifetime have never gone to a shelf, picked up a dictionary, and looked up the word carry to make sure you have the right definition. You simply know the word implicitly. You never needed an explicit definition. This is what happened in your native language, and it's what happens in any language you learn through authentic exposure. No stored direct translation, no dictionary definition, true implicit understanding like you have with the words well, just, yet, with, etc. I want to give an example of an abstract concept like love, because I think if we talk about an abstract concept, this just becomes 10 times more clear. Because with something like love, there's no object to point at, there's no action to be seen. It's an invisible word. It's completely abstract. It's a concept in our mind. So how would you even explain that word to someone who doesn't understand it? If you were going to explain love to a child, what would you say? Usually you don't give them a definition, and usually you're not satisfied to just say, well, it's a really good feeling, right? Usually you don't say that. Instead, what you do is you compare it to other things. You give them a list of things love is like. It's like how your mom feels about you. It's like how you feel when your dog runs up to you. It's like wanting someone to be okay. You're not defining love in the strict sense because you probably don't know the dictionary definition. Instead, what you're doing is you're pointing to relationships. Or in other words, you're defining love by its edges. This is why the question, how many repetitions until I understand a word, misses the point. It's trying to measure our understanding of words using an incomplete unit of measurement. What determines how well you understand a word is not how many times you've linked it to some definition or some direct translation or some single image. Instead of thinking how many repetitions do I need before I learn this word, think how many associations do I need before this word is clear. And I know people don't like thinking this way because it's far less clean, but it's way more honest about what language learning actually is. When people talk about wanting to learn a language fast or wanting to learn a language efficiently, they're usually talking about memorization, storing away words like objects in a database. When I talk about fast fluency, I'm talking about making as many associations between ideas in a language as fast as you can. And the best way to do that is by having authentic experiences in the language at a level you understand. People have this misconception that they can skip comprehensible input, that they can skip engaging with the language and just cram a bunch of words. They'll say, why wait to understand a word and input? Why not just learn it from a flashcard deck? But the issue with that is you trade the hundreds of contextual edges around a word and input for a single connection you see with the word when you're doing a flashcard. If you use repetition as your unit of measurement, then sure, you can just skip input and only do flashcards. But if you understand that how well you know a word is not measured by repetition, but instead density of contextual exposure, then you know it's not just about how many times you've seen the word, it's about how much context your brain gets per encounter. And the best thing about input is if it's comprehensible, if it's compelling, if you're giving it your full attention, then the quantity of contextual information you can take in is uncountable. If you trust in the pattern recognition power of your brain, then there really is no hard ceiling. I've had words that I've been able to remember after just one exposure because of the density of the contextual information around them. And that kind of thing doesn't really happen to you much in the beginner or intermediate level, but once you get to the advanced level, the more fluent level, that's where acquiring words becomes so much faster because you just have this rich network of context in your head that you can draw from. So as an aside, when I see beginners or intermediate learners focusing on vocab and grammar specifically, I think to myself, well, unless you really need that stuff then, fine. But if you can postpone it, you're just going to be able to learn it faster later. So I guess that's part of the reason I don't focus too much on individual words, right? Because I think to myself, the denser the relational model of a language is in my head, the faster I'm going to pick up new words. Only input gives you that fire hose of implicit information that's necessary for building a relational model of a language in your head. A deep, durable, interconnected understanding of each word, not just a bunch of labels floating around in the subspace of your mind. Sometimes in the comments, people will ask me if I'm scared of forgetting words. And the reality is, I do forget words, but they come back so easily. And the reason is because if you think about, a relational model of a language, every word I have has like millions of edges that connect to other words, right? So if we imagine me forgetting that word, we might imagine some of those edges being cut off and forgotten, but that still leaves hundreds of thousands of other edges, right? The words I know in Spanish are deeply embedded in this relational model, so I'm not really worried about losing them in the long term because I can always just rebuild those connections. Now, if you want to challenge your understanding of language learning even further, I recommend you click this video right here because this video questions the idea that we should be even focusing on individual words at all when we learn a language. I will see you there.